All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. If you want to take a seat. We've got our first session this morning, and I'll just let Joe kick us off.
So first we have a paper by Aljoscha Berve. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at Heinrich-Heine University Düsseldorf and executive director and vice president of the European Society for Process Thought. The author of the book and various articles on Whitehead. His fields of research include process philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of psychology, and German philosophy at the turn of the 20th century.
Thank you, and welcome everybody, not only to this presentation, but also to the conference at large. I think I have the most imaginative title possible for a paper on Whitehead, which simply says Footnotes to Plato. So I think quotation everybody knows. Ladies and gentlemen, it would be a commonplace to claim that the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead was deeply influenced by Plato. This statement is as true as it is trivial. There is no doubt that by far the most famous quotation from Whitehead's work is his contention that, quote, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato, unquote. However, in German philosophy alone, there have been two monographs entitled Footnotes to Plato, Fußnoten zu Platon. However, it is much more difficult to state precisely what the importance of Plato for Whitehead's thought is. The first volume of the Edinburgh critical edition of the complete works of Alfred North Whitehead, entitled The Harvard Lectures of Alfred North Whitehead, 1924-25, has brought to light new material that helps to determine the exact nature of Plato's influence on Whitehead. In order to contextualize these transcripts within the larger framework of Whitehead's philosophy, I will therefore provide a short overview over the different forms in which Whitehead takes up Plato in his writings published thus far. In a second step, we will then look at how the first volume of the critical edition has provided additional grounds for clarification of this matter. There is good reason to distinguish four aspects of Plato's influence on Whitehead's philosophy. First, it is surprising to realize that the only deep discussion of a Platonic concept by Whitehead is the adoption of Plato's notion of the chora into the highly sophisticated theory of the extensive continuum in the infamous fourth part of Process and Reality. This topic has received due attention by research, but it remains a very special field within Whitehead scholarship. Beyond that, Whitehead's main grappling with explicit positions of Plato takes place in Discussions and Applications, the second part of Process and Reality, especially the comparison of Plato's Timaeus and Newton's Scholium. Here, he also refers to his own concept of the eternal object as Platonic forms. Obviously, Whitehead's discussion of the extensive continuum, his adoption of Plato's ideas, and his recourse to the Timaeus in Process and Reality result from genuine interest, but we should be warned to put too much emphasis onto that factor. This caution is reinforced by the fact that Whitehead relies heavily on A.E. Taylor's commentary on the Timaeus in Process and Reality, as well as in Adventures of Ideas, and admits that much. A second aspect of Plato's influence on Whitehead is the obvious discussion of 7 general notions of Plato in Adventures of Ideas, namely the ideas, the physical elements, the psyche, eros, harmony, the mathematical relations, the receptacle. More to the point, the entire book is a reflection onto the legacy of Plato's thought to the tradition of Western philosophy. Interestingly, Whitehead might reasonably be considered an unabashed Platonist in Adventures of Ideas, although the book is more a reflection on the historical realization of general ideas within human societies than a methodically rigorous philosophical treatise. Looking beyond rigid structural argument, Adventures of Ideas articulates the conviction that, quote, philosophic systems are the way in which the human spirit cultivates its deeper intuitions, unquote. As we shall see, Whitehead quotes Plato as a witness for these deeper intuitions on a number of other points as well. Even further removed from detailed analysis is a third aspect of Plato's influence on Whitehead's thought. In The Function of Reason, Whitehead decides to introduce personifications for the two main modes of reason he discusses. Ulysses represents practical reason, while Plato embodies theoretical or speculative reason. The description becomes even more metaphorical. Quote, "The one shares reason with the gods, the other shares it with the foxes." Unquote. Again, Plato is connected to speculation. There is yet another facet to Whitehead's understanding of speculation, and it connects to Plato as well. If we accept Lucian Price's records of his dialogues with Whitehead as a somewhat reliable portrayal of his positions, then it seems that the speculative openness of Plato's philosophical outlook specifically appealed to him. Quote, "Plato seems to me to have been the one man in the ancient world who would not have been surprised at what has happened, because his thought consistently took into account the unpredictable, the limitless possibilities of things." Unquote. It seems prudent to assume that the decision to utilize Plato as an altogether representative for theoretical reason conforms to Whitehead's statement about the European philosophical tradition consisting of a series of footnotes to Plato. However, the symbolic importance of the identification of Plato with theoretical reason goes further. While Whitehead opens Function of Reason with a description of practical reason as a fundamental power of the universe, speculative reason occupies an entirely different place in the world. He is adamant that speculative reason is a product of human civilization and anthropological rather than a cosmological phenomenon. However, he is not interested in social explanation, but in scientific theory. Within the development of civilized societies, he feels confident enough to determine a specific point of origin of speculative reason. Quote, "But the critical discovery which gave to the speculative reason its supreme importance was made by the Greeks. Their discovery of mathematics and of logic introduced method to speculation. The Greeks produced the final instrument for the discipline of speculation." Unquote. The identification of speculative reason with Plato further reinforces its plausibility by the statement, "Whitehead cherishes Plato as not only a Greek philosopher, but more than that, as a crosser between philosophy and mathematics in the formative phase of both disciplines." The last aspect of Plato's influence on Whitehead concerns Whitehead's ideal of philosophical communication. Thus, we are dealing with nothing less than the fundamental question of the identity of philosophy. Even in his time as a mathematician, Whitehead was renowned for his capabilities as a teacher. It comes as no surprise, then, that he was interested in philosophy beyond the mere question of truth. In fact, we might assume that his shift to philosophy was motivated, at least in part, by his sound conviction that the quest for final truths is ultimately futile. Dogmatic certainty commits the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This is where Plato becomes relevant. In the preface to his Principle of Relativity from 1922, Whitehead explicitly states that he regards his audience as, quote, "silent interlocutors," unquote, with whom he has to manage a dialogue, reacting to their questions and demands rather than giving a monolithical presentation. Price, again, relates a discussion in which Whitehead ascribes this perspective explicitly to Plato. Quote, "He was at pains never to mean anything exactly. He gave every side of a question its due. I have often done the same, advancing some aspect which I thought deserved attention, and then in some later work presenting its opposite." Unquote. In effect, with this allusion to Plato, Whitehead turns the skepticism towards ultimate truth into a virtue. He regards the subjective standpoint of every discussant as an irreducible element of philosophical discourse, so that the process of undertaking a discussion takes precedence over a mere look at the results. Again, he locates this approach to conceive of philosophy as a speculative process distinctly with Plato. Quote, everybody has had a say, the subject has been examined from many sides, some of the aspects are more persuasive than others, but it is erroneous to identify Plato entirely with one of them. We do fairly well with half-truths as long as we remember that they are half-truths. On the one hand, Whitehead's emphasis on the persuasiveness of argument connects back to his conviction that all discourse must be based upon a shared environment of common sense. That every, quote, classification depends on the current character of importance, unquote, has a direct equivalent in his cosmology. His concept of propositions explicitly claims that in, quote, the real world it is more important that a proposition be interesting than it be true, unquote. On the other hand, it points towards his understanding of Plato in yet another way. In Adventures of Ideas, he argues that the process of agents in the world is one of force, from force to persuasion. In a chapter named Likewise, he claims Plato's authority to say that, quote, the creation of the world is the victory of persuasion over force. There is an obvious consequence of this notion of persuasion, now understood to be a metaphysical factor rather than a mere factor in philosophical debate, in Process and Reality, when he claims that God, quote, is the poet of the world, with tender patience leading it by his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. Unquote. The first volume of the critical edition provides material to suggest that this interpretation of the influence of Plato on Whitehead's thought ought to be expanded upon. The critical edition shows a surprising degree of coherence in Whitehead's perspective on Plato. Most importantly, the transcripts demonstrate a surprising understanding of Plato. Whitehead conceives of him mainly as a mathematician, whose metaphysics is a result of his dealing with eternal forms. Repeatedly, Whitehead insists that starting your metaphysical design with the topic of eternity, as Plato did, necessarily results in, quote, the metaphysics of the geometer, the logician, of the arithmetician, the pure mathematician. Unquote. Whitehead claims in 2 occasions that another metaphysical position of Plato ultimately was a mathematical argument. When Plato insists that mathematical points without extension are mere, quote, geometrical fiction, unquote, Whitehead takes this to be an argument for an interrelated world comprised of facts extended in time and space. Plato's dependency of metaphysical speculation on mathematics is, as Whitehead makes abundantly clear, not a mere fancy, but demonstrates the ultimate localization of Plato's thought. Quote, Plato was a mathematician, Aristotle son of a doctor, and that is essence of difference between the two. Plato was considering complex abstractions and how actual presupposed the idea. Aristotle was classifying, brought up to see the ideal after the example. Plato studied equivalent of Euclid and then looked about and saw here they find their realization. For Aristotle, it seemed that universals sprang out of the actual, the redness of plumage of stuffed bird, etc. A mathematician is bound to be Platonic. Unquote. The connections between mathematics and philosophy Whitehead is so anxious to emphasize in his philosophical propositions of science make it abundantly clear that he regards Plato to be a structural precursor to his own philosophy. We are justified to maintain that Whitehead himself carried important structural aspects from mathematics over to philosophy. For example, from a purely philosophical standpoint, it is baffling that in Process and Reality the second part is called Discussions and Applications, while the comprehensive theory of prehensions is only laid out in part 3. However, the solution is that this layout is a direct structural heritage from his work as a physicist. In The Principle of Relativity with Applications to Physical Science, Whitehead uses exactly the same exposition to demonstrate a strictly physical argument. We can therefore assume that even during his time at Harvard, his self-perception remained that of a philosopher heavily indebted to mathematical thought and practice. In addition to that, the passage quoted shows another aspect of the themes of Plato. The most prevalent situation Plato appears in during the philosophical presuppositions of science is in combination with Aristotle, whereby both function as antitheses to each other. This opposition of the two thinkers is not as prevalent an occurrence in Whitehead's main oeuvre. In addition to a number of references in Adventures of Ideas, in Modes of Thought, he contrasts, quote, Aristotle's analysis into genus and species and subspecies, unquote, the method of classifying worthy of a biologist, with Plato's doctrine of division, which he deems, quote, an anticipation vague and hazy, unquote. In Modes of Thought, we perceive this contrast as merely episodic. As the critical edition shows, Whitehead uses the combination of both as a much more fundamental, ideal-typical antagonism of opposing scientific and, in consequence, philosophical positions. Indeed, the antinomian character seems to be of such importance to Whitehead that he fills it with a number of complements. Plato's role as a mathematician, starting with potentiality abstracted from particularity, is contrasted with Aristotle's role as a biologist. Again, Whitehead stresses that he was the, quote, son of a doctor, unquote, who is interested mainly in the flux of things, the actual. As a result, quote, Plato rather put the flux into the ideal, Aristotle vice versa, unquote. The complements Plato and Aristotle embody, idea and actual, speculative division and analysis into genera, potentiality and particularity, provide a good overview over some main problem areas Whitehead saw his own philosophy concerned with. We may speculate as to why Whitehead did choose Ulysses and not Aristotle as the embodiment of practical reason in the function of reason. In all probability, he wanted a person completely outside of philosophy to emphasize the radically pre-scientific importance of practical reason as a method of life pertaining to all agency in the universe, not only to scholarly debate. It comes as no surprise, then, that he deems the approaches of Plato as well as of Aristotle equally valid, because the interplay between both perspectives is the fundamental activity of philosophical realism. Quote, philosophy of the Greek civilization culminated in Plato and Aristotle. Dual side to the culmination. Plato is the culmination with the primitive element still there. That's the charm of Plato. Aristotle might have been one of his own followers. The difference between them: they do sum up and express fundamental elements of any philosophy founded upon a naive objectivism. And this is implicit philosophy of scientist when he's really doing science. Any really thoroughgoing realism must have faced that question. That, Whitehead supposes, why Aristotle and Plato classes as once and thoroughgoing realists, because they did face that question. As Whitehead continues to explain, realism, in the sense he uses, means limitation and, following from that, processes of selective transition. With this interpretation of Plato and Aristotle of proponents of the same naive objectivism, implicit in any scientist who is doing science, he manages to turn both of them into systematic precursors of his own approach to philosophy. With this fresh perspective from the critical edition, we see much deeper systematic implications in Whitehead's statement at the very beginning of the preface of Process and Reality, that he considers his philosophy to be indebted to, quote, the two founders of all Western thought, Plato and Aristotle, unquote. Indeed, his appreciation of the primitive element in Plato and the naive objectivism underlying both Plato's and Aristotle's thoroughgoing realism, as we have seen, seems to be the very thing that enables Whitehead to follow this commentary with the statement that, quote, "the philosophy of organism is a recurrence to pre-Kantian modes of thought." Unquote. This interpretation lines up quite well with the famously programmatic chapter, Romantic Reaction, in Science and the Modern World. Whitehead rejects what he sees as a deep inconsistency in Western thought, namely a bifurcation between a scientific and an aesthetic approach to reality. When he determines his own position to be a, quote, provisional realism, unquote, he specifically traces back to the fruitful vagueness and speculative reach of Plato's philosophy, in effect returning not only to pre-Kantian modes of thought, but to what he deems the Platonic essence of philosophical dialogue itself. In conclusion, the critical edition sheds light on the importance of Plato for Whitehead's thought in a number of areas. While the philosophical publications of Whitehead thus far contain various points of contact with Plato, these oftentimes remain out of context and unconnected. The transcripts of the philosophical presuppositions of science do not add entirely new aspects to the debate, but support us with further evidence in areas where Whitehead's magnum opus remain vague. Up until now, every analysis of Whitehead's appreciation of Plato's openness for philosophical discourse had to accept the authority of Lucian Price's Dialogues of Alfred North Whitehead. More importantly, the critical edition manages to present the structural importance of Plato as a mathematician, not only for Whitehead's philosophy, but also for his identity as a mathematician turned philosopher. In effect, Whitehead's concept of a provisional realism and his return to pre-Kantian modes of thought both stem from his long-held perspective on Plato and Aristotle as the ideal typical embodiment of the fundamental contrast of organized thought that informs both his concept of scientific theory and his speculative cosmology. Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. We've got a good 20 minutes. I will keep a cue. Just grab my attention. I've got George and Jude to go, and then just grab my attention. I'll add you to my list. So, George.
I was reading your manuscript as you were giving your talk, your abbreviated version thereof, and of course the interesting thing you're trying to do is to see to what extent the first volume of the edition sheds any light on this question that we were stuck with, the popular understanding of Whitehead's alliance or allegiance to Plato vis-a-vis. Collingwood claimed, R.G. Collingwood claimed that Whitehead had stated that philosophy was a series of footnotes to Plato, but had he only read Aristotle, he would have realized that his own philosophy was a series of footnotes to Aristotle. And it does seem to me important to emphasize, as you have, Aljoscha, that in the lecture notes of the first year's class, we see a much, much richer and livelier discussion of Aristotle and Aristotelian approaches, as well as his emphasis on analytical, mechanical versus biological and organic, Aristotelian sort, than we would have recognized in his former works, thus, in a way, undermining projects like Collingwood's and Ira Clare's, trying to show how Aristotelian Whitehead was. There's no doubt that he was. He says so. Okay. But other piece, that it's mathematical, it is typical of the mathematician. This, I think, is one of the most important insights we get. But what Whitehead does in the classroom and what Whitehead does in his written works is typical about how a mathematician, and particularly a geometer, would go about laying out an argument, not a philosopher. Okay? And that really, the combination of those things, and then the interplay between the dialogic and the propositional or doctrinaire, doctrinal, that sort of is more pronounced in the lectures in his classes than it is seen in a lot of his reports. Does that seem, all those things seem fair characterizations of your position at this point?
Yes, I mean, very short answer, yes. I think what strikes me as the most important difference between his appreciation of Plato and Aristotle, first of all, is I sometimes get the hunch that he didn't read Aristotle that closely.
Yes.
So,
You would have seen dialectic playing a same role in Aristotle.
yes,
Obviously.
yes. So, but that's on the side of speculation. More than that, I think what makes Whitehead as a philosopher so interesting is not his dealing with a certain aspect of science in and by itself. There are more thoroughly working authors in any single field, but the way in which he manages to transition from one field to the other one, to connect all of that within one theory, or at least attempting to connect all of that within one theory. And it strikes me as the most important legacy of Plato, apart from the direct legacy, that he, Whitehead now, basically took Plato to be this universal mind, able to get from one point of discussion to the next one without sort of leaving a specialist debate back, but trying to take over part of the discussion from the last field into the next one. And I would argue that this is sort of the ideal of Whitehead's thought in essence, but it's very hard to prove that. And we just have to rely on this anecdotal evidence that we now have in a much higher degree of basically notes he gave in lectures, which he probably wouldn't have put in writing, because it is a bit more provocative than what process and reality looks like. So, again, on a speculative side of things, I think we might be justified to at least infer that there is much more systematic depth behind it. He's not reading these authors of antiquity as mere episodical, but he really tries to model his thought on them. And then I think we can never come closer than just speculation.
So I've got Julian and Dennis, Paul, Jason. So, Jude.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the very beginning where you're setting up the contrast that we get in functional reason between Ulysses and Plato. And you talk about Whitehead in a sort of Goethean way, associating Ulyssean reason, practical reason with the cosmic forces themselves, whereas the Platonic speculative is, you say, anthropological, not cosmological. So I wanted to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit, like what's at stake in the distinction, because, and here's the but to the question. So I want to hear what you mean by that distinction and what you want to really be doing with it. Because in a sense, isn't it also the case that the anthropological is a species of the cosmological, in a sense? One of the other papers for the conference talks about the sort of anthropic dimension of Whitehead's description of how the cosmos works. And so the anthropological seems to be an outcome, a sort of natural outcome of cosmological. If you think about the role of eternity as the evocation of possibilities, which is what speculation is as well. So it seems to situate itself in cosmological pretty well. And then even the realism that you're talking about really nicely, by the way, I really appreciate what you did there. It crystallized something for me from this volume that really helped me. You talk about it as a manifestation of the very, and Whitehead does, of the very transition, cosmological transition that it's trying to describe. It seems to be an instance of it. So I'm wondering, like, what's at stake in that distinction? How far would you want to push the cosmological versus anthropological?
I think that's exactly the point that always bugged me about functional reason. Because I think it's a bit muddier than we take it to be at face value, which is to say that it comes with this cosmic approach to things, and that's sort of where this I cut off the Goethe reference in the presentation. I know, but
Sorry, I was reading along and
very good.
my ears didn't notice.
So thank you explicitly, but I think you can see, and by the way, Goethe would be a very interesting comparison to Whitehead on another level, but that hasn't been done as of today. You can see that he goes back to the ultimate, grandest possible scope, which is the evolution of the universe. But then he also, when he talks about speculative reason, it becomes a scientific theory, or a precursor to a scientific theory. And he explicitly states that it only started once they found a method of speculative reason. And I mean, I get what he's doing there, but he seems to connect to completely different fields, and I really don't see that this works without problem, in that he tries to argue on the one hand for a, let's say, metaphysical, cosmological dimension, and on the other hand he really comes back to the way in which at some point human beings in the Greek hemisphere started to do mathematics. I mean, that's a very now intricate discussion, I think, at this point, but suffice it to say at this point that I do think that he could do something with that. It's a very intriguing way of splitting up reason, as it were. But he really can't take this to be an ideal, typical opposition to each other, because then he would have to claim that while speculative reason was at work from the very get-go, it never attained any sort of, well, order, of orderliness. It just operated by some sort of happenstance, by the way. And then at some points it goes click, and at this point I think we have problems justifying practical reason within a scientific context, because as soon as the method of speculation is introduced in mathematics, the role of practical reason, which is to provide a method of, well, a life method, pretty much gets occupied by this notion of speculative reason. So I can't see the clear distinction on that side then from that point onwards. So I think he wants too much with the book, as it were. But in general, I think it's a very nice idea, let's put it that way. And I would have very much liked him to elaborate, let's say, perhaps one more chapter on the the joint between the cosmological dimension and the scientific point. As far as anthropology is concerned, I think to me, it's a very big problem in Whitehead, because yes, we can say that he anthropomorphized the entire universe. On the other hand, we might actually say that he de-anthropomorphized human experience. And I think that's, I never see that anywhere, that position, but he has a very static idea of what human experience ought to look like in the beginning of Process and Reality. And this sort of seems to come from his, well, dealing with scientific theory and his concept of education, or theory of education, mostly. But there are certain aspects that don't get any attention from him at that point. So if we say that he anthropomorphized the entire universe, then I would question the quality of this anthropomorphism as a, let's say, good representation of what a broad idea of being alive as a human being actually means. But that's an entirely different discussion as well.
So we've got 10 minutes and about 7 people in the queue, so which is good. I mean, we got lots of good stuff to talk about. Lehman and then Dennis and Paul.
I think my question will be very brief.
Okay.
I just want to get some clarification. Central question, how is it that the critical edition, first of all, illuminates our understanding of life beyond what's in his published works with respect to Plato? And your answer, as I understand it, is, well, you're not going to find anything that sort of illuminates our understanding beyond what's in his published works. It's anything very specific, but what you are going to get is a more systematic treatment of Plato in the lectures than you're going to find in his books. And if that's the case, exactly how so?
Yes. So if I might take an analogy, let's say if this was a murder case in court, then it would be a watertight proof, but it would be just circumstantial evidence. Yes. So I think what the critical edition shows that is that he connects, when he talks about Plato or Aristotle, he always connects it to other fields. So this connection is absent if you look, for example, at Adventures of Ideas, in which he talks about Plato and also Aristotle to a certain degree, but it's always unconnected, systematically speaking, unconnected to other fields. So it's just this instance of this instance of this instance of. And it strikes me as rather interesting to see that in the critical edition he makes a connection. And this connection, as I said, isn't watertight, but he talks about it. And that should be evidence enough to at least think into that direction. And in the process of that, I think we can sort of get away from relying on Lucian Price, to a certain degree at least, as far as Plato, Whitehead's notion of Plato as a discussant is concerned. And that's enough for me.
That make Brian and Dorothy very happy.
Dennis and Paul Jason, Dennis.
Yeah, I want to come back to your unimaginative title, as you said, because I think there are two perspectives on this quote that the European philosophical tradition can be characterized as the series of footnotes of Plato. On the one hand, what, for example, Rorty did was to say that philosophy cannot be defined by saying this is philosophy in contrast to individual sciences, and on the other hand, because you have to find a common denominator for the different traditions within philosophy. So what you have to do is say that a philosopher is somebody whose thought, whose thinking was characterized by other philosophers and their vocabulary. So a philosopher is somebody whose way of approaching a problem is shaped by Plato, Kant, etc. This would go very well with your reference to Adventures of Ideas, that the 7 notions found in Plato are central to the European philosophical tradition. On the other hand, Whitehead, or at least what both Bell and Hawking note as far as his lectures are concerned, he starts by saying, I'm going to consider a number of problems as if no philosopher had ever looked at them before, and only later on, so to say, as a didactical addendum, I will say how far that relates to the history of philosophy. Do you think those two perspectives are really incompatible, or would you say they are compatible in the sense that what Whitehead does is really just didactical, and it's just something that has bothered everybody who read Process and Reality, also because it's from philosophical, or from the perspective of somebody who is into philosophy and history of philosophy, it's didactically very strange.
Yes, I think I would agree, basically. I also think there's one more twist in this footnotes idea. This is that it seems to me that Whitehead's idea that analysis can be taken in two ways, to be either genetic analysis or coordinate analysis, extends to his understanding of philosophy as well. So there is a sort of analogous way of understanding things. And I mean, that is very modern in the early 20s, late 19th, early 20th century, this idea that you have these two modes of interpretation. You find that in field theory all the time, you find it in psychology sometimes. So he doesn't invent that, but he takes that to a certain extreme, and he says that if we analyze philosophy according to its history, its genetic offspring, then we are going to come back to Plato in the same way in which any actual entity comes back to precursors. But that's a very formal idea. I think, however, you cannot reduce that. And going on from there, I think your idea, saying it's a didactical move, I think that bears some weight. How far? I don't know. I mean, I really would like to be more precise than that, but I don't dare to. So
we got Paul Jason, Fitz, Richard, George Al, if we get it, which we won't.
Thank you, Aljoscha, for your paper. I'll just second what George and I guess by implication, Lehman's questions were pressing the impression we get of Plato, the shadow of Plato looming over this, which is so interesting. But however unfair, I'd really like to ask you some more about Aristotle. I had the opportunity, since this was in my hand digitally, to do a quick count. The number of times Whitehead refers to Plato and Aristotle is about the same, more for Aristotle, but I don't think numbers being what they are, stats being what they are, that was significantly different. But my question really comes out of, or my prod really comes out of how different their uses, their referencing seems to me, it seems to me most of his comments about Plato are asides. Some of them are very interesting, and you've milked some of them. It seems to me very effective. Curiously, when those are linked to Aristotle, his Aristotelian comments there, his characterizations there are also asides. I mean, he's the son of a doctor, he dwells on classification, which turn out to be not at all what he investigates when he looks at Aristotle more closely. I mean, what's striking is, in addition to those kind of quick shots at Plato and Aristotle and how we think of them and how they were companions to him through this kind of enterprise, what we do not find here is a series of lectures on the Phaedo, the Sophist, or what we really might expect is, give us 50 lectures on the Timaeus, right? Since that's what he references so clearly elsewhere. We don't have that here. So we have to piece together the bits and pieces as you have. And I think effectively, but with Aristotle, it's not just that we have more than that. We actually have a series of lectures on not the posterior analytics, not the ethics. What we have is a series of lectures on the metaphysics. And curiously, the edition just out of Oxford that he is making use of here only come out the previous year. So this was new stuff. You mentioned briefly whether, wondering whether Whitehead himself had ever read Aristotle closely. Well, we're watching him read Aristotle closely in these classes. Whether he'd done it 10 years before, or 20 years before, or as an undergraduate, I don't know any more than anybody else does, but as he's leading his students through this discussion, through a series of lectures, this is not the first time he's thought about those. They're really quite extraordinary graduate seminar level discussions of substantial change in the idiom that Aristotle is generating here. And you can see that ripple through a lot of what he's trying to think through himself here in 1924. These all come up mostly earlier in the year rather than later. So you acknowledge that both of these traditions and influences are valid, but it does seem to me they come through these lectures in different ways. There's kind of a reminder of Plato's back there, and he's a kind of hero, a kind of model that he undoubtedly carries in mind as part of his identity. I think you're exactly right about that. But with Aristotle, there's a real grappling in the text of exactly what the issues are that he's trying to deal with here at the level of supposition. And I'm just curious and prodding you to see if I can get a reaction to whether these are quite different uses, quite different levels of handling we find in these lectures.
Yeah. I think
last comments and then we'll move on.
So I think you're on the spot there, which is to say, I think one of the problems as a philosopher I've always found with Whitehead is that when he talks about other philosophers, he oftentimes misappropriates them. So he takes them and then does something with them. And if you don't read Hume yourself, you will get a very strange idea of what Hume actually ought to have said in a certain aspect. I mean, my favorite example is this in Aims of Education, in the Rhythm of Education, he talks about this sort of cycles of education, and he says that's basically a Hegelian model. It's the same thing Hegel tried to do in his dialectic philosophy, and you can see that I'm very much in the tradition of Hegel. And then there is a celebration of his 70th birthday in Harvard, many years afterwards.
Yeah.
And he gives a very short lecture in which he says, by the way, I've never read a page of Hegel in my life. Which is not true, I've read one page of Hegel. So you see that if he hadn't made that comment, we would have put much more emphasis onto the fact that, wow, he's really trying to think in the Hegelian tradition. No, he hasn't read any of that. And I think, as far as Whitehead as a philosopher is concerned, we have to take his word that he really doesn't know what he's talking about, much of the time. At least from a certain point onwards. So,
on that provocative note.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for the last four people, but we've got a half an hour break at 11, and so keep your questions for then and track people down, please. So our second is by me. We'll skip. You got the IO there. We'll skip over that and jump straight in if that's okay. You've got the long paper, and it's way too long to read all of it. I'm going to skip around a little bit, just because I'm interested in a drive-by of what called to me as I was reading the edition, and so I'll do that drive-by sort of approach here largely. So in a way, as we know, this entire conference is an attempt to answer the question posed by my subtitle, do the Harvard course notes change how we understand Whitehead's thought? Each of us is considering a version of this question from the perspective of our own philosophical interests. Whether you've answered it affirmatively or negatively, or more likely somewhere in between, depends much on your own standing interpretations of Whitehead's thought. For my own part, I would say that there is no smoking gun passage that finally contradicts my previous understanding of Whitehead's thought. However, it would not be correct to conclude from this that the first volume of the Harvard lectures are insignificant. Indeed, I would go so far as to suggest that these materials will indeed permanently change how we understand some of Whitehead's thought and biography. Characterizing the nature of this impact reminds me of a passage for lectures themselves. On October 2nd, 1924, Whitehead said to his Radcliffe students, quote, "New theories are always turning up which don't fit in. To say that the earlier forms are wrong is not as good as to say that they're lacking in richness of conception. There is modification rather than overturning, real change and a gain in richness." This is how I myself understand the impact of the 24-25 lectures. It's not so much that they overturn previous understandings, rather by providing insight into the development of his project, the Harvard lectures deepen the richness of our conception of his thought. There is a notable exception to my claim that the lectures don't overturn previous understandings. Thankfully, the first volume of the edition has made it possible to settle one of the most long-running and previously intractable debates within Whitehead scholarship over Lewis Ford's emergence hypothesis that Whitehead discovered temporal atomism in April of 1925. It's clear now, as Paul makes clear in his introduction, and as George demonstrates really nicely in a forthcoming article in Process Studies, that is, we can say, is false. I think you don't usually get to say that, but I think in this case we can say that. We can discuss that more, but George would be and Paul would be better people to have to than me, so I won't focus on that. So I thought about just approaching the edition from the perspective of some of the work I've done, but instead, as I say, I'm interested here in taking a broader view from a higher altitude and looking at how we can gain access to the development of Whitehead's thought as he lectured in this first year at Harvard. So in the first section, I'm interested, which is probably all I'll get to, in three ways how we get access to the development of his thought. First, we get access to comments that he makes about his pre-Harvard work. Aljoscha noted in his abstract for the conference, one of Lowe's lasting contributions to Whitehead scholarship has lied in this periodization of Whitehead's work, and in three periods, and this happens frequently. We find that periodization isn't inaccurate, of course, but we should not overstate it either. What we get is also both development and continuity, and he clearly already had a lot of the ideas that appear in later works in his mind when he arrived at Harvard, and I think these lecture notes start to reveal that. We also, though, in addition to that, get him referring to the principles of natural knowledge, concept of nature, the principle of relativity. Throughout these lectures, they're usually asides in passing, but he's pretty hard on himself and in interesting ways. And so trying to collect these is kind of fun. I'm not going to read these. Paul does some of that in his introduction too. You can find them there as well, right? But a silly avalanche of new symbols in Principia Mathematica, is it, right? I let myself be fooled. He did not have a full theory of mentality and concept of nature, right? So it's just kind of interesting to be able to take these and say, as we then read his works, his earlier works, this is what he himself thought of it later, what was missing, what he wasn't doing, and that it was what he was trying to do now. That he was in a confusion, and that he, in particular, in his discussion in class, what he saw himself doing, I find this passage particularly interesting because he says he's trying to look at what lies behind the ideas in his earlier work, which is an interesting way of him to describe his own project. Separate from his comments on his earlier published work, we also get him making comments about other philosophical positions, which he doesn't, to my reading, frequently do, and I wish he had. The first concerns vitalism, a position with which he's sometimes associated, and we get him here commenting really nicely and explaining how he thinks that's a mistaken position. He himself thinks that you've got mechanism and vitalism, and he's rejecting both of them. I think that, well, I wish that he had said these things in print. And so we get them now, and I think that's helpful. We also get really interesting discussions about how he conceived of hypothesis. Something that is behind his first chapter of Process and Reality. And they're rich and long, extended discussions of how he's using this term that we don't, in my view, get a lot of earlier in published works. We also then third get him commenting on specific philosophers scattered throughout. Again, sometimes they're odd. Frequently, they're sort of stuck in, but yet nevertheless, when you collect them all together, there's more there than we had in the published works, because he didn't oftentimes do a good job of citing things. And so you can at least, he cites Hegel quite often, and you can piece them all together and say, well, what did he seem to know or not know? Was he being flippant in his, in his 70th birthday sort of party, or not? We just get a little bit more to go on. It's not enough to be definitive. I'm not saying that, but it is more nonetheless. On Russell, always an interesting question. We get sometimes in the Conger diary that'll be in the next volume of the edition, we get his students saying they kept trying to bait Whitehead to say things about Russell. They kept trying to get him to, and they usually couldn't. But here he mentions Russell usually positively, but not always. And so again, that's useful to my mind. And then finally, on Aristotle, as we've been talking about, he's just much more positive. And he's interested in the metaphysics, and he's clear about that. He thinks that his reading of Aristotle, he's interested in because he thinks Aristotle is getting at the right questions, even if he doesn't like some of the way that Aristotle was appropriated later. And then on Kant, I'm not quite sure what to do with this. He's consistent in wanting to recur to pre-Kantian modes even here, but then he's got this nice little passage that Hawking records, but Bell does not, and so I don't trust it quite as much, that his reading of Kant, which seems rather close, to be honest, closer than I would have thought, it was one of the reasons he turned to philosophy. Just interesting tidbits, and again, so this is interesting to me. Second section concerns some of the influences and inspiration for his thought that I didn't know was there, or I didn't know how deep it ran. The first concerns L.J. Henderson, who's going to be a topic of discussion here, and so I won't belabor it at all, other than to say that it was exciting to see how explicit he was. I also discovered when I was preparing for this, not only does he mention that Henderson was where he got these ideas from, but I looked at the later 1930s classes, and he was then in the 30s assigning Henderson's books as required reading for his class on his syllabus. And then Henderson has these, he does these strange appropriation, as he frequently does. I'm not going to read this. It's a really wonderful long passage that I have in the paper about the role of the environment. We get this discussion of the Brazilian forest, and that exact discussion, well, not the exact, that discussion shows up in Science of the Modern World. The same Brazilian forest gets referenced in Science of the Modern World, so you get sort of a direct comparison. As I mentioned in the paper, you also have this environment of friends discussion that's in Science of the Modern World. Actually, Eugene Hargrove claims that that passage in Science of the Modern World might have been the inspiration for Aldo Leopold's notion of the biotic community. I don't think that's ended up being true. I don't think Hargrove's right about that, but it is interesting. He's been claiming that for decades. An additional influence was this anarchist, Kropotkin. He just says that's where I got my idea for mutual aid as balancing it. Balancing Henderson. So we've got this mashup of Henderson and Kropotkin, which is fascinating. C.D. Broad is where I really dug in and got fascinated the more I looked into the relationship. And he uses Broad's text as required reading. It makes sense why it is. And I again don't have time to go over all of the interesting relationships, but it's one of the things. A couple of things that fascinated me was that Broad draws a distinction between critical philosophy and speculative philosophy. Rejects speculative philosophy. Broad does, but that Whitehead himself adopts it, and it was interesting because Whitehead in the lectures says, I don't like his. I think his distinction is artificial, which it probably is. But then he accepts one of those to describe his own work later, which was interesting to me. Of course, that term has an older history, but when I started reading Broad himself and then went back to reading the notes, things started to jump out at me that I didn't see before. As I mentioned in the essay, for example, Whitehead's description of philosophy not being a science seems to be an actual direct response to Broad's claim that it was. Further, Broad himself, in preparing the manuscript for this 1923 book, Science and Thought, had taken extensive notes that we actually have on Whitehead's books. So we have about 75 pages of notes that Broad took on Whitehead's books in preparation for this volume, which then Whitehead used in his class, which is quite interesting. We also have then at the end, after Whitehead's died, we have Broad writing this beautiful essay in the journal Mind in 1948, honoring Whitehead. And so there seemed to be an ongoing relationship and influence between the two thinkers. And you get in a passage like this, Broad he spends a lot of time on the first two phases of Whitehead's career and he says, I didn't understand the third phase, I didn't understand what he did at Harvard. And he says, I don't believe anybody who says they do. Basically, right? They counted among those who wonder with a foolish face of praise, but that basically we is quoting, who is it? I forget, I looked up the reference, a famous quote that Emerson picks up in Self-Reliance, but it's not originating in Emerson, right? So he's skeptical that anybody understands Whitehead. How much time do I have? 10 minutes?
8 minutes.
Yeah, all right. Sorry, this is sort of fire hose pace. So, third discussion I have here that you can look at in more detail, and I'll just really just push through these. All of this sort of terminological experimentation was exciting. So we've got the common frustration that Whitehead has too many neologisms in his works, and then we find in his lectures that there are far, far, far more than what ended up in print. And so you get the first reference to eternal objects, you get the first reference to prehension, you get the first reference to a couple of terms, but you also get all the others that don't make it and they get cut later. And some of them I wish he had kept, others I'm glad he dropped. Like translucency is cool. I think that's really great. In particular, I really liked formula. Formula is just a great term. I wish he had kept it in his later works. When you abstract an organism from its environment, you get just a formula. You don't no longer have the organism as a formulation, which is a really nice way of putting it. We also then get his discussion of objects, which is all a bit of a mess in my opinion, but he talks about the difference between primary objects, which sound a lot like internal objects. He divides those into pure objects and social objects. And then totally other part, you've got emergent objects. Emergent objects initially sounded a little bit like, he says they're behind everything, and it sounded a little bit like actual occasions, but then it can't, and he says they're really what's actual, which means they can't be eternal objects. But then he goes on to describe them in a way that sounds like that they're more nearly the past or actual the actual world, as he describes later. So my own view on this, as a first foray into it, is that he's muddling through, as he would put it. He knows he's got his finger on the right issues, but he's not yet satisfied with how he's describing it, and he abandons many of these divisions later. And he says that he can't get a ghost of a glimmer of light here, and I think he's right. I think he's just barely not that. But we see him thinking in class, struggling through them, trying to figure out a way to express his ideas. I can't discuss the Shadow of Truth passages, even though I found them to be especially fascinating. Last bit of drive-by, because I just can't resist, and I did the PowerPoint, so I'm going to slam it in here, was on the Victor Lowe biography. This is less about the first volume of the edition and more about the research that we've done in order to produce the edition. We get in 1929, so Victor Lowe, after 8 weeks in the class, says, I dropped the course at this point. We just, as Joe was mentioning, just got Whitehead's grade book. It was not available until 80 years. 80 years from when the grades were given. And so it's the day it was finally available, we asked for it, and they were nice enough to send us scans of it. With Lowe, we do find that he dropped the class. He got no score for the first grade, whatever it was, the first reporting. He got a B on the first exam, and then he switches to auditing. And what's weird is if he audited the class, why aren't there more notes? Is my question. Why wouldn't he have kept taking notes? I don't doubt that he audited. He must have been sitting there, but why was he sitting there without taking notes? Because we have the notes that he took. Or at least I'll say, we don't have any evidence to suggest that we're missing notes that he did take, but it's possible.
Why take notes for no exam?
That's entirely possible. I also don't think that he was a bad student. I just don't think he was a great student. He was probably concerned about his grade enough to switch to auditing. But I wouldn't say he was a bad student. I just would say he wasn't a great student, from what we can tell based on the grade book. And then he takes the class again for later, 7-8 years later, and we have some of those notes too. He audits the class in the 30s. Finally, what does he not discuss much or at all? God, creativity, beauty, actual entity, concrescence, satisfaction, intensity, the ontological principle. And so what can we infer from that? Well, he wasn't solving his metaphysical problems with recourse to God. We can say that. He wasn't talking much about creativity as an important philosophical concept. It recurs, for sure, but it's not yet a significant metaphysical principle. Beauty doesn't appear much at all. The aesthetics does at regular intervals, and Helmut will talk more about that. Actual entity, not at all. Concrescence, not at all. Satisfaction, not at all. Intensity, once or twice, but not really as a technical term. Ontological principle's not there. Actual occasion appears as a phrase, but not as, in my view, a technical term. So a lot isn't in this set of lectures, which means, and they did appear a few years later in the Giffords, which means the next sets of lectures which should tell us when he started playing with that terminology, when he became more specific, and we'll be able to find the points at which those terms emerged. Apologies for this speed of that presentation.
Just an addendum, the very material you're working on now, that we're working on, you and Joe, the next year or two, a lot of those terms do begin to appear. And, excellent. ab novo, what would be the right term? He's introduced, he's dropped some of the things you were citing and using, and already substituting things that are going to become more familiar, and yet they're still not in quite the form we're going to expect them. Like instead of having a single occasion with phases of presence, you've got two kinds of occasions. The one you introduced here, the experience occasion, stays on, and then an imaginal, the mental side, the conceptual side, is a separate kind of thing a year later after his lecture. So if you're asking how can we trace the development of Whitehead's thought as opposed to imagining it from textual insertions, as Lewis was supposed to do, you've got it unfolding for you.
I'll let Joe handle the cue this time, so I can.
Out of your list, I've got 2 points. One, I'll just make brief mention of. That top 3 or 4 you listed missing. At least I think I'm in the right ballpark here. One word that does come forward persistently is value.
Agreed. Yeah.
Realization is achieved, there's value achieved. So something is going to be unpacked of that in the next couple of years, and it leads to a lot of these richer aesthetic.
I agree. There's tons on value, and because that's so important for my work on his ethics, I was really, really excited, and that's where I'm going to dive in when I do go to compare my own work, with what we discover here. And so I completely agree with. But the way in which he uses beauty briefly in Religion of the Making, as something is good when it's beautiful sort of idea. You get some nice tantalizing bits in Religion of the Making. So we know it's in his mind at this time, but it doesn't show up in class much in terms of beauty as a concept. Value and aesthetics, yes, that's kind of Religion of the Making. But I wish what we see in Adventures of Ideas as using beauty as such a significant concept, I think really just occurs to him more later. I just don't think it's the way he's thinking about it right now. So it's not so much that he changes his mind, it's that he's not choosing to use that concept to express his views right now, even though he's got the rich aesthetics there. So I guess I agree with you in that way.
Given that we've all been born into an era of fact-value distinctions, I mean, he's plugging value right from the outset.
Yeah.
A more substantive question, if Joe will let me get in something more substantive. You focused a little more heavily on hypothesis. Extraordinary set of lectures there where he explores that in great detail. And it seems to me it has implications for this other topic you raised about the relationship between science and then thinking about science, the presuppositions of science, the doing of philosophy, ultimately metaphysics. Because I guess I'd really like to know what your own take on this is. It strikes me, I thought he was talking about hypothesis when I first came to this. He was talking about hypothesis as we would in a philosophy of science course. It's the mode of doing science, and he has a fair bit to say about that. But he also seems to me to be talking about this is the way we reason through things anyway. So even if I'm thinking of presuppositions now, or ultimately I'm trying to structure my metaphysics, I'm working by hypothesis. It's not a distinction between science and philosophy, it's actually a common mode.
Yeah, my own view, and I'm just getting started on it, but I'm really taken with Whitehead and Peirce's usage of the idea that metaphysics as hypothesis. It's an unusual and a distinctive and important way of taking metaphysics in this fallible, open-ended way. So Whitehead's clearly drawing on science and his understanding of science and the model of science, but he's again, always he's appropriating it in this strange way. And so to my mind, his discussions of hypothesis here are explanations of his view of metaphysics and speculative philosophy. And there, sometimes he's just talking about the scientific method. Other times he's really just talking about what he thinks good philosophy should do. It should help us see what goes unnoticed. It should, right? And so that must have been a strange thing for his audience too. He's using these common terms, but he's using them, as always, in weird ways. And so I really enjoy him finally telling us a bit more, because he gets these tantalizing, metaphysics as a hypothesis, but then he doesn't go on a lot to explain it right there. Here he does.
As you say, since in PR he goes on to identify with speculative philosophy, speculative metaphysics, the kind of metaphysics that the rest of philosophy is repelled by. It seems to me that Mickey has taken out a lot of that by recognizing this element, hypothesis-driven mode of approaching metaphysics.
Okay, well, I've got Dennis and then Helmut and George.
Yeah, just a short remark. You have all those nice quotations of Whitehead referring to his own previous works, especially the principles of natural knowledge. He said he seemed to be pretty harsh on himself, saying that he was in a muddle then, etc. I just wanted to remind us of the fact that in Science and the Modern World he refers to the Romantic thinkers as muddled thinkers, and he says some of the most brilliant thinkers at that time were muddled thinkers because they just perceived dimly that there was something missing and first had to find the words to make them expressible or thinkable. So it's not necessarily being harsh about his own previous works, just saying that I sort of had a glimpse of what I wanted to do or wanted to think about that only had to be preliminary because I had to find the right concepts to deal with what I thought was missing.
Yeah, what I admire about, I mean, I had that story about him and Russell, right? Birdie is clear-minded, and I'm, you know, I speak this sort of, right? It's it's a nice passage, right? You get this muddle that he embraces his muddle-headedness, right? And I admire that about him. He doesn't do what C.D. Broad says philosophers should do, which is to make everything perfectly tidy, clear, and that's the job of philosophy, and he refuses that. So I think that's definitely going on, that he doesn't ever get past that muddle. So I agree with you. I do, though, think, I mean, when he says not only that he's a muddle, but he's confused, or he was fooled, or, you know, and then he's being, I mean, harsh maybe is not the right way of putting it. I'm just saying he's saying he, in hindsight, thinks he's dissatisfied with how he put it there, that he was in some ways wrong. I find that to be really helpful for him to say, I think I was wrong here. Because he doesn't say to correct much.
Yeah, I don't think he's giving those citations of those works in this context to the students as I was being muddle-headed in a good way. He was rather, I was being clear, and now I think I was clearly wrong. He's incomplete, and I think that's a different point and an important point, and probably true, in that if you look at his later work as a kind of transcendental ontology, you know, not a transcendental analytic and dialectic for cognition, as with Kant, but as for the conditions of possibility of experience and being itself, this would be right. These things that are, he's now exploring the ideas that must lie behind the possibility of those things that you put clearly but incompletely in those works.
Well, I don't know whether it's because we are both from Düsseldorf, but I would like to get to the same point as well.
Okay.
I think Whitehead here is very generous as far as criticizing himself as well. And I wouldn't doubt that at some points, of course, like any thinker, if he is thinking, makes mistakes, and that he can find them. But that should not prevent us from seeing with clear lines of continuous development. In a small way, I'm trying to prove that on aesthetics, where you have a line which goes right through, I mean, with modifications, but it's not as if in 1919 he had a notion of aesthetics which he completely turned around and went on to something else. So there might be specific errors, and anybody who is thinking will make errors as well. But it should not prevent us from having a very clear line of very different tracks where you can see a continuous development of ideas. And I mean, that's part of the beauty of the critical edition as well, that you are able to find those tracks, you know, where you can see from very early kind of grain-like nucleus which develops into a full theory of metaphysics.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Well said.
These words, we shouldn't be surprised that he's changing his terms, because the key thing about Whitehead is that these terms are inadequate by definition, right? Right, so clarity is the supreme example of abstraction, and the price of abstraction is inadequacy. So what Whitehead does, there's some wonderful things in Process and Reality. When he wants to use a word like feeling or whatnot, he's, well, I could call it this, I could call it that. And in Inventions of Ideas, he does this with peace. He got 4, 5, 6 different possible terms that he wants, none of which are adequate, and he finally uses one.
Right.
So some of these shifts are not mistakes that he made, so much as because of the purposes of what I'm wanting to talk about now, the inadequacies of that earlier term are inhibiting me. And so I use another term. It's going to be inadequate in its own way, but that is not adequate for the particular task I'm using now.
I don't take me as combining the comments about his own shortcomings in earlier work with the terminological experimentation. I don't mean to be linking those two things at all. So I mean just to say that the failures of these experiments, or the waging of these experiments, and then the moving on, is revelatory of his thought process. But I don't see his abandonment of them as evidence of he's thinking he did something wrong, or that he's satisfied with taking terms and making them perfectly clear. Because as we know, he rejects that model of philosophy. It's just that we get here a richer set of terms, and when we put them all together, we actually then get a better sense as to what he's trying to express, because it's the ideas that are the important thing, not so much the trying to codify crystal clear terms. So I guess I completely agree again that's what we should expect of him, and we do find from him, and that's sort of reassuring in a good way.
I just add one sentence, because what I found interesting is that at one point when it says, I'm using a different term here, because if I use the same one, it would tend to become a fetish, and everybody would say, well, this is your main principle. Now I'm using a different one to make the same point.
I've got Jude, and then William, and Ron, and
Joe, can we interrupt for a point of order here, just for Brian? I'm new to this business, but I do have the book. And where are there footnotes that capture what you're talking about?
Which?
I'm hearing wonderful comments about what's written here,
Yes.
but how will there be a future
Yes.
publication that? Oh,
Yeah.
that's,
And if you register, you've got all of our papers
no, I have that.
on that, and all of those have citation to page numbers.
No, I understand that all of. Yeah, I have the.
Yeah.
But it shows us really the question of how to quote.
Yes, that's the
It's,
problem.
it's, it's, he tried to give it, but it doesn't seem to have been clear enough.
Thanks.
Well,
Look at this one right here. It's very clear.
Could I add,
Keith, 649.
for Stan, can I add all the best comments we've heard so far are already in the introduction?
There's that.
I think Jude was next.
Yeah, I just wanted to, on some of the terminological absences, I think intensity's there a little more, I mean, in terms of favorite issues for me, but like 5 or 6 things that have that systematic sense of what intensity means, but what is there more frequently that I think undergirds a case for its presence is the contrast and things related to the notion of contrast.
Right.
He's absolutely committed to the notion of contrast at some very crucial points. And the intensity stuff comes up both when he's talking about the physics stuff and mathematical stuff, which is where he gets it ultimately in terms of development. But also when he's talking about that qualitative, intersecting, describing things. So I think it's there, it's just not to the extent that we get it later systematically.
Thanks for that. I'll try and make that more clear than I did at the end of the paper, but when I write it up, I should be more clear that the terms are not prevalent, but the concepts that the terms will later describe are there,
Right.
almost always, with only a few exceptions.
Yeah, I didn't take you to be excluding that. I just wanted to get it out.
Like concrescence, he doesn't use that term, but he's got all sorts of interesting attempts to describe what will become his phases
Right, and
later.
then things like satisfaction, we don't get that. We get superject
It gets
which has
super vague.
overlaps with the meaning, but we do get words like completion. And the word completion fulfilling the role that satisfaction does, that's when something exists, or, you know.
Right. So it's more of a theological question of when do these terms become, you know, his way of trying to express his thought. But the thoughts are already largely there, and sometimes more richly described, interestingly, here
Yeah,
than actually in the
I
books.
wish you had some of these things.
The
Yeah,
pattern stuff, the environment stuff, the value
It was
stuff.
on your
Yeah.
display,
Yeah,
but
that was-
yeah.
Good, William, and then Ron and Neiman.
Bill Meyer, Marable College. Two thoughts. One, Dennis and George's comments about terminology made me think of Whitehead's emphasis on the primacy of experience for language, right? We're looking for the words, which is kind of against, we're talking about Wittgenstein last night, against that linguistic term. Puts the primacy on language as the basis of experience. Second point, when you were talking about objects, Brian, and his different terminology, came across a passage in the notes, and I left my book back in the hotel room. At one point, he starts off with this question, you know, what is it that's most basic in reality? And it sounds like he's starting to talk about something like an actual entity. He doesn't use those terms. But then he starts talking about an enduring entity, you know. Now, as I read it, I thought, is he trying to sort out the difference between what he'll later call actual occasions and societies, the things that endure?
Enduring objects.
What's that?
Enduring objects.
No, enduring entities.
Enduring
is different than
entity-
enduring objects.
Does anybody remember? He was. It seemed to me he wasn't quite clear yet in his distinction between actual entities and enduring ones, or at least he seemed to talk about them so closely that I thought he was talking about the former, and then all of a sudden he kind of sounded like he was talking about the latter.
He's struggling with those questions here.
Yeah.
And he is, and he's struggling, and I
Yeah.
think he was least clear because he's using object in so many different ways.
That it's
And that's where actually obscures his point, what he's trying to express.
get at, yeah.
But he's really still fairly good here on pattern, which
Yes.
is key to endurance.
Pattern, that was a phenomenal term,
And
very helpful.
It was. I agree. You get the contrast in there too, and the environment as well. And so, what I like is that you get a clear examples, which you don't always get in the text. You get him relating electrons and organisms
that was very
and
helpful.
animals in ways that he didn't do. And so it's helpful for me to now, because when you teach this material, I give these examples, and I think to myself, I think they're right, but I've always been really unsure. And now I feel very confident in saying this is really what he had in mind.
Yeah.
He was trying to go from electrons to dogs in a metaphysically coherent way.
Yeah.
And so,
Cats,
cats maybe.
I mean, if I say one last comment, pattern, if a society illustrates an enduring, ongoing characteristic, is a pattern another way of making that point? That there's a pattern of continuity?
The pattern's the
over
only
time?
thing that endures.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that endures. So, Jude will talk about it. It's the last
Yeah,
paper.
It's not that it endures, it's that the
It's-
permanence is an expression of the aggregation of processes. And what he defines enduring object is the repetitive ingression within an aggregation which has spatial temporal continuity.
The-
It's not that it's permanent, it's repetitive ingression defined by
Showing up over time?
Showing the definiteness of that, its mass, its charge, or whatever.
It's not a question. It's just a statement.
Those characteristics ingress repeatedly in a succession of events with emerging parachutes, and that aggregation constitutes the enduring object.
I think that you're right. I think that's what we get from his later work that you're describing. But I would only add that sometimes he sounds to be saying it's the eternal objects that are what are repeated. The ingression of the eternal objects is what provides for the continuity. Other times it's the past. And so sometimes, and I think this bears out through all of his work from the beginning, that he varies on this. And so it depends on if you go with Jude's interpretation of the efficacy of the past or not. or you go the sort of the Leclerc Christian interpretation, which is just simply saying it's the eternal objects, which is the more standard interpretation. So I guess I'm just saying I think that these lecture notes continue to show that both of those are going on even at this first year of lecture notes.
I think the more fundamental comment I want to make is Whitehead has conveyed on many of his work for so long. Whitehead, other Whiteheadian scholars would say, Lenin knew Whitehead better than Whitehead did. But he had 30 years to reflect upon all the very intimate experiences that he had as a co-teacher, processing reality, and all kinds of open debates. I think most people don't realize how open it was. But I think to understand Whitehead's work as a whole, we have to see it as an unfolding of ideas, an integration of concepts and integration of axiom and deduction. It's a philosophy and evolution. The last thing Whitehead wanted his philosophy to be was like monks reciting mantras, because he saw most fundamentally that to be true to itself, process philosophy had to be continuous processes of creative development, creative application, and what a lot of scholars, and maybe more home theologians and philosophers and scientists, that it had to be in a continuous process of modification. So I would say even in the most final formation of Whitehead's concept of axiom, we saw the incompleteness. It's kind of like the incompleteness theory in mathematical logic.
Amen.
There's no proper way to understand Whitehead's philosophy and his attitude toward his philosophy without the kind of metaphor of mathematical logic, the incompleteness of it. That's how we view it. So our burden is to creatively develop it, creatively apply it, and also to creatively.
Well, one thing, and we'll end and go to break. One thing I would love someone to do is that had more facility with Principia, is to read this volume through and I hope maybe I can get Nick Griffin to do this, is to read this volume and ask to what degree is this material what would have been the fourth volume of Principia, because he's got such rich discussions of geometry here. Mm-hmm. And that was what that volume was going to be about. And I'm not able to, I don't know Russell's work well enough and Principia well enough to do that, but I hope someone who really is expert on that can answer that question. To what degree is what Whitehead is doing in class is in fact what was intended to be the fourth volume? I'm not saying this is, but I'm saying I think we get some of what he was working on all those years and gave up on geometry. I think it's kind of partly here, which would be exciting if that were true.
Right?
Yeah.
We can get one more method of abstraction.
Yeah,
and
time more. Oh, okay.
Metaphysician and mathematician is the father of numerology, which is the expression of what the fourth volume is to be. But the important thing about that is the ontology of geometry changes, and how that changes and how it unfolds really answers some of the questions of Thomas' comments about the footnote. Because I think Whitehead, to look at that footnote, we have to see Whitehead speaking as a mathematician and also as a poet. As he was developing ideas, the contrast between that which occurs and that which doesn't occur, events and form. And then the poetry is see how these presuppositions and concepts have their roots in antiquity, because the present inherent the past and the shape of it. And I think it's not so much Whitehead as a commentary scholar, because he wasn't a commentary scholar, he was a creative, speculative scholar. I think he was a poet, finding the metaphors and the analogies which are expressed in our intellectual history. But he wasn't trying to analyze them to death.
You actually get him here talking about the difference between what he calls a literary approach to philosophy and what is the other term? he contrasts a literary approach to I'm losing it, but he contrasts those who emphasize symbolism and those who emphasize the poetic, and he has some recurring contrasting of these approaches. And what I like about it is that he emphasizes the benefits of both. He'll talk beautifully about the benefits of symbolism and the precision that it gives, and you don't just get him gushing about the literary approach. You get him seeing the benefits of both, and he's obviously adopting portions of each of the.
Lehman, do you have a quick final comment? Because you were waiting for a while.
Well, one of the reasons why Whitehead had his papers burned was that he didn't want scholars poring over a non-gloss. He thought we had better things to do with our lives. So here we are doing it anyway.
Clearly we don't. He was wrong about that.
In any case, his point was, if you really want to know what I think, go to my books. Here's where my considered thought is, and here's what I wanted in publication and what I wanted to be read. One of the things I think your talk reveals, in a way, is that no matter how much time you spend trying to really understand in detail what's going on in something like the principles of natural knowledge, even to the point of going back and learning this mathematical formalism that's been abandoned for 80 years, you still won't understand it. And part of the reason is because here are ideas that are in flux. He's always changing his mind. And now he's going back and saying, well, that's a muddle, and a muddle in the bad way. So you can't even go to the books, in this respect. So just the point about the ideas in flux here. It's always a process.
That's a good place to stop. Excellent.
Reconvene at 11:30.